Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 167. And it is not a story, it is not a continuation of The Island. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, didn't you do this like 2 episodes ago? Yes, I did. However, today is my 50th birthday, and I think part of it is because I am turning 50, and part of it is being cut off from a lot of human contact by the coronavirus, and part of it is because of that I have the hair of a 1700s utilitarian, but I am definitely feeling philosophical. I have been like all week. There's definitely something about 50, half of 100 and so on, feeling different from previous birthdays, for sure. Like, I always heard, like, when I turned 30, I was really upset. Or if it's not 30, that's like, a 30 didn't feel so bad, but 40, I really felt, I really hit, that one really hit me. I don't know that either 30 or 40 really hit me, but 50 definitely is. And I suppose it's because, like, things are happening in my life, like more is changing faster now than it has for a long time. 20, that doesn't really hit anyone, really. No one's like really sad to see their teen 8 years go so that they can, now they have to be in their 20s. No one's really sad about that. But that feels like, my whole adult life felt very like staid, very very quiet, very like not much going on. Like, things changed very slowly for the most part. I moved a little bit and so on. But it wasn't until a few years ago that things started to really change. I was widowed, of course, and that sort of set everything else in motion. But anyway, yeah. There's also something about 50 that feels different from anything else in terms of just straight up aging. I'm like, I always remember when I was in past years when I was younger, the term middle aged, and that's never really well defined. In fact, it seems to have changed over time, and if you look at definitions, it's like, sometimes they're as early as like the mid 30s or even early 30s. Sometimes it's the 40s. Sometimes it seems to be like the early 50s, but not really. It's like, but then middle age sort of is the 50s, but it's not. No one seems to know like how long they last or when they start, what they are. So because of that, in my head, I always thought of middle age as the halfway point. And because of that, I always did the math in my head. So when I turned 30, it didn't really hit me that hard in terms of being middle-aged. And maybe that's why it didn't hit me much at all. 30 to 60. Well, I can probably expect to live past 60. As it turns out, that's a false assumption, of course. And I knew it at the time, but just on average, I could expect to live past 60. 35, well, you double that and that's 70. And, that's getting up there a little bit. Most people in the US live past 70, but, that's getting up there, and that's certainly feels something like the halfway point. And yet, I was hoping to live past 80, and then I hit 40, and then all of a sudden I was halfway to 80, and that felt a little, I think that's why I think of the two, like the 40 hit me a little bit harder, just because at that point, okay, yeah, I really kind of am halfway there. And yet in my head, it's funny how we play these games with ourselves. I remember thinking, well, okay, like the first 8 years or so of my life, I barely remember because I was like a little kid. Those don't really count. It's like, I've only, when I was 40, it's like, I kind of remember 32 years of life, so that's kind of all that counts, right? So, add another 32 to 40, and you're at 72, and that's not even quite to the life expectancy. You know what I mean? I was playing that kind of game. That kind of game. So, yeah. And now I'm 50. Yeah. And when you double 50, I don't even remember 45. Simply because I think I don't remember, just because I was widowed shortly after it, and that has like that completely threw like all the memories of stuff like that are just gone. Anyway, so I don't even know what to say about that. But obviously, if I was thinking about it, 45 into 90, well, even taking away the first few years, we're definitely at the halfway point at that point. But I wasn't really thinking about it. But 50 now. I'm halfway to 100. I would have to make it well past what what you would expect a normal lifespan to be. And it definitely is a change. Like, I can feel that philosophically and just even emotionally sort of hitting me and changing what I'm thinking about and what I am considering important. And so, yeah, that's also the other thing I wanted to sort of touch on. And that's just like my philosophy over the years has changed. And that really has been a very slow, gradual process. Especially, well, when I was 15, I sort of realized, oh, okay, religion. I've told this story before, so I won't go into it too much. But basically, I made an error in the church we were going at. Everyone looked at me, but like nothing happened. You know what I mean? There was no like bolt from the blue. I just had a church full of people staring at me for being a dumbass, and it had been sort of a long time coming, because I had sort of realized that there wasn't any feeling from like prayer. It just felt like thinking. But that was sort of the moment that I sort of realized, oh, it really is like a social thing. Like, religion is a social thing, I mean, people think of it as like a bunch of magical thinking and all this, but when it gets to the world, when it gets to reality, that's what it is. It's a social construct. And and I always, for years, that's how I thought about religion. It's like I didn't want any part of it, and I was no longer religious. I considered myself, I had sort of an agnostic theist sort of period, maybe in college, I think, but somewhere around the end of college, I just sort of said, yeah, in my head, I was like, yeah, no, there's no God, and trying to halfway, it doesn't really make any sense. There just isn't. People think there is. A lot of people think there is, but there just isn't. And that's sort of how I've dealt with it beyond that. When it came to religion itself, because I recognized that there was like this social thing going on, and there was some social value to that, because you're making connections with people and so on. I didn't really have a problem with religion, except as far as that went, and as long as they weren't extreme and harming people who are outside their faith, I was fine with it. I was happy to sort of live and let live. So that was on like the religious end of the philosophy world. And on the more the political end, it was partly informed by this sort of, rationalistic, originally sort of utilitarian. I suppose I did go through a utilitarian sort of phase. Anyway, now I consider myself just a humanist, essentially. So, but at the time, I was sort of more utilitarian, sort of rationalist. I went through an objectivist phase, if you know what that is, Ayn Rand and all that. And it was never like really, really hardcore, but I really thought like she had some interesting things to say. Still do on a philosophical level, but I'll get to that in a minute. And politically, I came from a family that had one of each. My dad was Republican, my mom was Democrat, and that was how they voted. In their case, I think more than necessarily believing in one party or another based on the ideas of that party, uh, in terms of like a well thought out, like, I definitely agree with how the party is or how the party's going or whatever. I think both of them just came from a family. One, my maternal grandparents were Democrats, my paternal grandparents were Republicans, and that seems to have just carried over, and that was sort of a thing for like a long time in this country. I don't know if people really talk about that, and it's not just like, oh, you're living in this part of the country or whatever, or you're living in this particular neighborhood or or area that is mostly that party, so therefore everyone's sort of in that party or whatever, or you just sort of naturally gravitate to that party because the people around you are. It's not really that. If it really did feel like there's a long part of this country where it was kind of handed down. It's like, if your parents were Republicans, you were probably you were basically Republican. And I was sort of halfway in between. Because I had one of each, I didn't really. I kind of had to think about it. And in college, I ran into libertarianism, which in many ways is sort of halfway between them. It sort of they believe in limited government, and I kind of looked at the situation. It's like, I like the Republicans a little bit more when they talk about like money and business and and trying to keep government to sort of a minimum on that end. I didn't like them when they were talking about like religion and social issues. And then I looked at the Democrats and it was kind of the opposite. It's like I wasn't really into what they were saying about business and so on. But I very much agreed with them on the social issues. And because of that, that's sort of classic libertarianism. Now, libertarianism sort of changed in the intervening years, and it is much closer to some sort of conservatism now, where like socially it's pretty conservative as well, and it's definitely nothing I would have ever agreed with. And partly because that started drifting over the years, and partly because I felt like my ideas and my beliefs and my attitudes and so on were also shifting just very slowly over the years. I was very much a libertarian for a long time, and was happy to even vote libertarian and so on. I still, to this day, I've almost always voted libertarian when I could until very recently. And because of that, I have never lived under a president that I voted for. So, and that includes all the way up to, even the ones where I, was voting for the particular person in Democratic or Republican parties. They ended up being on the losing side. So I ended up never living under a president I voted for. So the first time I voted for a president, it was for Mondale, and that was because it was Mondale, right? Yeah, and he came to, or is it Dukakis? Anyway, it was 1988. Bush ended up winning, but I voted for the Democrat because he actually came to my college and spoke with us. In fact, I got to ask him a question, and he sort of semi-evaded it like a politician does. But he did it in a pretty reasonable way. And because Bush refused to come to our campus and he actually did, he had an invite and it was sort of semi-accepted, and then he realized that our college had a policy of anyone who comes to speak also needs to answer questions from the student body, and he refused to do that. So he quit, and because of that, the Democrats said, you know what, I'll do it. And it worked for me, so that was enough to get me to vote for him. And this is also before I sort of discovered libertarianism. This was very shortly before that. So didn't, under Bush Senior, and I didn't vote for him. And then a bunch of years went by. I was libertarian. And then the next time was 04. W was going for a second term. I really felt he did not earn it. He completely botched his job as president. He had been given all these briefings about how, like terrorism was going to be the big issue and you need to make sure that, nothing happens. And in about a year into his presidency, 9/11 happens. And then, as if that blunder wasn't bad enough, then he immediately just goes apeshit, lies our way into a war in Iraq that they had nothing to do with. And we're still dealing with the bullshit from mostly from him. I mean, it's like, yes, granted, it was 9/11 was the thing that sort of kicked it off, but our response to it was also very, very, very important. And Bush was awful, and he was a bit of a joke as far as like presidents go. Anyway, he really was. He was a pretty awful president. He really was. He definitely didn't deserve his second term. So I actually went out and I even sort of helped carry. I wasn't very good at it, but I did kind of join the local Democrats who were like helping carry out. There's also, that was like the first time that there was some really despicable things going on that I really saw or at least cared about, where it was the Swift boat veterans who were basically lying about Kerry's war record. They were saying that, his medals weren't really earned, and other things, and they were like spreading this through like a lot of advertising, and it was like a really nasty smear campaign that was sort of like just barely out of like the president's, like the president, Bush could sort of still stay out of the fray, sort of. And then these guys were doing all these nasty advertisements, and in a way that wasn't really common or even heard of before, not on this level. But anyway, I voted, of course, for Kerry. He did not make it, and we got a second term of a useless president, and he remained useless. Now, at this point, not just because, I was helping Kerry out, but even before that, I was sort of looking again at libertarianism and moving somewhat away from it. The more I looked into objectivism, the more I realized that the things I liked about it were sort of like, they worked on a philosophical level, but not necessarily on the ground. It's kind of the same argument. It's funny because libertarianism and communism are very, very different, because, communism is all about controlling people and so on, and taking control of the means of production, all that sort of stuff. And it doesn't work very well in real life. Libertarianism doesn't really work well in real life either. And I was sort of slowly coming to realize that. It's like on a philosophical level, there's still part of me that is drawn to it, like the idea that government should be as small as possible, that people should be allowed to do things unless there is a real reason that they shouldn't. That makes sense on some level, right? I mean, no one wants there to be excess government. Like, you should not be able to do things simply because the government says so, and it doesn't really matter if there's a good reason for it or not. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't really help in any way. But I was sort of slowly coming to see that just because that is sort of like something that you can aspire to or kind of want to have happen doesn't mean it's going to work out very well in the real world. And over the more recent years, say since 2000 or so, because I think I was drifting away even in the late 90s, because I saw, like, even in the 90s, I was sort of seeing, like, where, like, if you really took objectivism and objectivist libertarianism to, like, extremes, it stopped kind of making sense. So I kind of was drifting away even in the 90s, but sort of towards the 2000s, I also saw where it was causing, like it was actively like just not going to work. And but yet, despite that, because I had been libertarian for so long, and because I had sort of this part in my head where it's like I really don't want to, you know, give up these beliefs so quite yet, and because I wanted to see good on both sides, you know, of the Republican and Democrat, you know, part of the world, because you know that's pretty much all of America. You know, it's a two-party system essentially. Even though I did vote libertarian, it didn't really do that much, of course. And for the foreseeable future, it's going to remain that way apparently. But anyway, so I started to see that, you know, there were problems with what I was feeling. And here's the thing, because it ends up being like libertarianism works better on the social side of things than it does on like the money side and the government side of things. So, and I still believe this, and this part actually does seem to work, but basically as long as, you know, if you're not harming other people with, you know, your beliefs, your actions, and so on, there really shouldn't be any reason for there to be a law against whatever that is you're doing. So, you know, that's why I feel, for example, and I have felt for a long time, you know, sex work should be legalized. It should be, you know, regulated, but there's absolutely no reason that it should be illegal to do something that is voluntary on both sides. Now, we're not talking about like, you know, sex slavery or the sex trade in terms of like, you know, people who are abused and put into horrible situations. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about like actually having like voluntary consensual sex work. Similarly, drugs, the drug war has been just a nightmare and a real problem in this country. And that was one of the things I recognized for, you know, a long time ago. It's like, this is just not working. But as a libertarian, you sort of would do that, right? It's like you would see that the efforts to squash illegal drugs don't really do much. They're extremely expensive. They put a lot of people in prison. A lot of the people who are in the prison aren't violent. They're not really a threat to anyone. And if you made drugs legal, you could take all those resources and put them into something much better. And in fact, you could just take a fraction of what we do to try to keep drugs down, just put them into rehab, and then you could have all the rest of the money, all the rest of the man hours and all that, you know, all the manpower and people power to do other things that would be much better. Anyway. So I've been, you know, so socially, I'm more or less, I haven't changed, but the money side, the business side has really changed. And this one was a really long, and like I say, it was a long time coming for me to actually sort of come to this realization, admit it, and all that. But the problem with wanting the money side to be the same as the social side is that the money side is different because of corporations, essentially. When you make drugs legal or whatever, or sex work or whatever sort of social issue that you're talking about, when you make that legal, it doesn't really it doesn't affect other people. It doesn't harm other people. You know, if, on the other hand, though, because corporations are big, powerful, and they are allowed to lobby, that is causing problems. And that has become more and more and more apparent over time. It is now very clear that the money interests have huge control in this country. They have immense power. They are very happy to like keep things, you know, the way that they are. Like, it's very hard to, you know, because one of the other things is because I was sort of, like utilitarian and, you know, and a humanist, I also believe in science. And when I see that corporations, twist science or simply deny science or squash science or prevent policies from going into effect, even though, the science is there. For example, with, global warming and climate change, it happened, even a long time ago with, the cigarette companies did, with smoking. They kept policies slowed down and altered and as long as they could, and they did a really good job of it because, the initial cigarette science was coming out in the 50s, like the early 50s, and nothing really changed in this country in terms of socially until like the 90s, really. Like the late 80s, 90s was sort of when things sort of started to turn, and you started to actually have like clean air in public places for the most part. And and the problem that I do see now is, and I don't have a problem with like individual when it comes to money. Like I do feel individuals should be allowed to spend their money and so on. Just like I feel like on the social end, they should be able to. But the problem is when you have, when people group their money together into corporations and the corporations have there's really no way, like if a company does something, if a person does something that kills someone, you can go to jail. You can't put a company into jail, even though there are many companies that have killed people, that have ruined people's lives, with chemicals, with pollution, with with avoidable accidents, with all kinds of things. But there's no, it takes away the individual responsibility. And because of that, I do feel like in this country, we do need to treat companies differently than individual people. I looking back on it, the rules that made it so that companies are essentially treated as people, like they have full quote unquote First Amendment rights, and they can essentially spend their money on campaigning and so on pretty much any way they want, has been incredibly detrimental to doing anything against the interests of the companies, essentially. And and you might say, well, that's probably enough to sort of push you maybe a little more liberal, and I guess I am. And if it was just that, then that's probably where I would be, and I would probably be sort of like this essentially centrist, like old style centrist, but maybe with maybe liberal leanings. But what has really pushed me in the last few years was seeing sort of the mask come off with conservatism. Conservatives have gotten really ugly in the last 4 or 5 years. With the rise of Trump, you see there's all kinds of extra, racism, ableism, sexism, all kinds of stuff like that, should be like going the way of the dodo. And it's been coming back in a big hot hurry because, well, basically because Trump allows it, wants it, spreads it. He makes fun of female reporters. He shuts down reporters who are people of color. He does things that are anti-gay. He does things that are, that are racist, straight up racist. And he does things he does dog whistles to racist people all the time. It should have been, and it was to me obvious in his first campaign. He had 2 big slogans. One is America First. He used that one a lot. That's, if you look at the history of that is straight up a KKK slogan originally. And it's been used by other sort of fascists and other and populists and other hardline, ugly-hearted people around the world, whether it's Germany first or France first, or whatever. But in America, the KKK used it as America first, and Trump used it as a slogan in his campaign. The other one is "Make America Great Again." That is, some people, it's vague enough that people are sort of allowed to put their own stamp on it. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I think we should, blah, blah, blah. We think of, the picket fences and whatever. But what it really, what it is, and to his base, it is a call to return to like Jim Crow laws. It is literally a racist request, essentially. So "Make America Great Again" is essentially saying, if you're racist, you're with me. That's what that is. That is a dog whistle to racists. And if you're wearing a MAGA hat, that makes you racist. It really does. Not just in my eyes, I don't think. I think this is... I think you're either incredibly naive or you are racist. And if you're really that naive at this point, if you don't notice the racism that's also going along with it, not just the slogans, but the actual events, yeah, you're really missing out. So that is also pushing me. That's not really changing my philosophy, though, because I was always anti-racist. But it did sort of make me realize that how much work there is left in this country to do, and that there is, it made me kind of realize how much racism there is, and how much I've had to sort of wake up to that fact. That's the problem with being white in a country where white is the race and power, is because the way things are set up, they make it as comfortable as possible for you to be white, which means you don't notice the things that make everyone else uncomfortable. And this is race, but this does affect, this is a sexism thing. This is also, other things too. And LGBT, of course, and all, Q and all that. In many ways, I am an incredibly privileged person. I'm privileged in all the ways that you can be, except for the one voluntary one, essentially. Because I am cis, I am white, I'm male. And then the only thing that, the conservatives would hate about me is the fact that I am atheist. But being an atheist isn't obvious. It's completely non-obvious. I mean, unless you just wear it on a t-shirt or something, it's completely non-obvious walking down the street that I have any different, religious beliefs than anyone else. And for them usually too. I mean, unless they're wearing religious garb. And that's kind of how, I'm perfectly okay with that. But so the one way that I am, not in the privileged class is not really, for the most part, it's often not easy. It doesn't affect me a lot. It could happen, but it doesn't. And it's certainly not in the way that racism, happens, and sexism, and so on. So I found that, there's a lot of. I've been doing a lot of work on myself to sort of see, like, okay, these are problems. Like, the system is set up so that some people succeed and some people don't. The idea that, anyone can make it in America is one of those things that's, like, technically true, but the thumbs are on the scales real hard. And if you're a person of color, especially if you're a woman of color, if you're hitting multiple of those areas, if you're LGBTQ and all that, if you're multiples of those and you're still making it, you're succeeding despite the system, which is incredible. And so many people don't make it, despite the fact that they're white and whatever. Looking back on my life, I definitely had it a lot easier because of my race, especially. partly because of my gender and the fact that I was straight. But I think in my case, it's mostly because I'm white, just because of the areas that I'm in. I would have had it a lot harder otherwise, for sure. And it's a very weird thing to come to a realization of, but it is something that, I had to come to terms with over the last few years. And anyway, I'm not voting Libertarian anymore. And while part of me, is still not happy with the Democrats as a party, part of that's left over from, beliefs I've had throughout my adult life, and part of it is just, I don't know what else it would be, but anyway. But I'm going to be definitely voting Democrat for a while. I cannot see myself rejoining, voting for any conservative under any circumstances at this point while they are acting in this way. Even on, like I said, even if there's other options or whatever, as long as there's other options, I won't be voting for a conservative at this point, because they have shown that they have a real ugly heart to them, and there's no way I can in good conscience vote that way. Can't vote with Libertarian anymore. I just see too many problems. The money powers are too powerful. The corporations are too powerful. We are we've lived in sort of a semi-oligarchy for a long time, where basically the money powers sort of have most of the power, and but there's still a veneer of representative democracy over it. That is really, really dangerously close to just becoming fascism now, of course, because of the conservatives. But even if Trump is voted out, the oligarchy is still powerful, and it's still going to be there. Nothing's really going to change in those terms. We will simply put off the worst possible short-term outcome. That's what will happen. And so I'm definitely going to be voting Democrat for Biden in this case, and Harris, and they seem like decent people. But of course the other option, Trump, is unconscionable. I did not vote for him in 2016, and I did vote for Hillary Clinton because by then I really wasn't interested in libertarianism anymore anyway. But also, regardless, I think even if I was still feeling libertarian, I would have voted for Clinton anyway, because it was really important that Trump not become president. And now we know why, because we've all seen it for the last few years. And sadly, between the good economy that he had handed to him at the beginning of his presidency, that sort of allowed him to sort of coast along without really doing much, we didn't really see, obviously if you're a person of color or whatever, if you're gay or whatever, yes, you definitely saw the downsides. But I mean, if you're part of the privileged part of the country like I am, you wouldn't have necessarily, if you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't have necessarily seen a lot to go on in terms of Trump's, dangers. But I hope you do now. I mean, the massive violations of the Hatch Act during the Republican convention, the fact that there is no Republican platform, they believe in nothing. They believe they will go along with whatever Trump says. That's the party of a fascist state. That's not a party in the United States. That's ridiculous. So, anyway, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. This has gone on a lot longer than I thought. It's been interesting, though, thinking about these issues. It's also very stressful, of course, especially since what with COVID, which is the other main thing that I think most people who are in privileged parts of this country are actually going to notice, is that Trump is ignoring science, screwing up how everything is going. I know that there are people in that echo chamber who just won't hear it or won't want to believe it, and that is what it is at this point. We can't do much about it, on the short term. But there are a lot of people who at least have some access, to regular, to actual news, actual news channels, and who will recognize, that this is going, that his responses has been completely botched, and there's a reason for that. I mean, this is sort of like the modern version of libertarianism, where it's not really about minimizing government, it's about dismantling government, and there is a difference. And that's something I really never stood for, even in sort of my 20s when I was sort of semi-hardcore libertarian, but I wasn't. But it was like an older, more genteel version of libertarianism. And even then, I was never like, sort of a dismantlist, essentially. I guess that's what we're going to call it. So, yeah, and you see them just, but if you look at the leaders that Trump has put into almost every head of agency, if you look at the head of the EPA, the head of the EPA is anti-environmental and is a corporate bigwig. If you look at Betsy DeVos, the education head, she doesn't believe in public education, and she only believes in private education. And there are other ones, and practically, the Barr, the justice head, is anti-justice. He's like literally thumb on every scale. It's crazy. He's a dismantlist. So modern conservatism is sort of like this weird combination of like conservative social types, who are hardcore religious types, and then these like sort of weird modern day hardcore libertarian types who aren't really about minimal government or finding, the right amount of small government, but actually dismantling government. And it has gotten really, really dangerous out there. So anyway, that's my 50th birthday. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter, and thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2020 CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved.